You need to have 2 foundational sessions each week. And I just don't mean that from a training perspective. That's also from a full presence perspective, where you are completely engaged. The world is shut out. You're not thinking about what's going on at your job or your family at that moment. You are 100% dedicated.
That Triathlon Show, episode 107. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and today I bring on the third ever, I believe, repeat guest, and that is Gerry Rodrigues, a triathlon swim coach that many of you will know from Tower 26. They have an excellent podcast called the Be Race Ready podcast, and Gerry was on all the way back in episode 3, where we discussed mostly technique and the technical aspects of swimming, simplifying that, distilling that down to the 3 most important elements. So I highly recommend you check that out. But today we go more into what the actual swim training of a triathlete should be like and what it should not be like, importantly. So Gerry Rodrigues, just quickly, as I mentioned, he's the head coach at Tower 26 in Los Angeles, California, and he's been coaching for 35 years, and he's got a swimming background, but started coaching triathletes in swimming right away. So he really specializes in coaching triathlon swimming, and makes the important distinction of swimming and triathlon swimming, which is why I think he's such a fantastic coach to follow and learn from. And as I said, his podcast, the Be Race Ready podcast, is really the best place to follow him. It's just amazing. It's one of those podcasts that you can go back and listen to episodes many times over and just really try to absorb all the information. We'll get right into the interview with Gerry after thanking our sponsors. We have Precision Hydration, and Andy, the founder, recently wrote a great blog post that I mentioned before, but I think it's super important because I know that a lot of you are training for Ironman races at the moment, and this blog post is about how much dehydration you can tolerate during an Ironman. And although this is very individual and may vary even within an individual depending on the day, the climate, and so on, it usually falls somewhere between 2 to 4% of body weight for most people. And as you know, getting your hydration right and your sodium intake and electrolyte intake right is crucial in those longer events. And you can get your first box of Precision Hydration electrolyte product for free on precisionhydration.com when you use the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word. This episode is also sponsored by Triathlon Corner, a triathlon webshop that you can find on triathlon-corner.store. They also have a great promo code for 10% off all purchases in the entire webshop, and the code is the same, That Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps. Whether you're looking for a new wetsuit, running shoes, bike computer, or power meters, they have it all, plus much more clothing, gear, gadgets, and gizmos. Make sure that you check them out and use that promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW on triathlon-corner.store. Alright, so now let's get into the interview with Gerry Rodrigues. So today it's my great pleasure to welcome back as a repeat guest on That Triathlon Show, Gerry Rodrigues from Tower 26. Gerry, how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks. How are you? Thanks for having me on again.
Super good, and very excited to get going. We already had a really good pre-interview chat, so we're all warmed up, I want to say. And the topic that we have today, well, first, a little bit of background. You were on episode 3 of this podcast, and that's still one of the top 3 maybe downloaded episodes that we have, and that was on your swimming technique teachings, and so the listeners are very much encouraged to go and listen to that. It will be linked to in the show notes and everything. Today we're going to talk more about the actual training prescription and how to get it right, what mistakes people do in it when it comes to swim training, and swim training for triathlon specifically, which is something that you really, really specialize in. So let's maybe start with a few common mistakes that triathletes make in their swim training planning and prescription. Can you talk about that?
Of course. It's interesting. I gave quite a bit of thought to this because I think there are many mistakes, at least from this coach's perspective, that triathletes make. But what I did was I went through and I ranked them in order of priority. So I thought I'd talk about 2 or 3, just that would hit sort of the macro target. Number 1, I think the most important or the biggest mistake, and you might laugh at this, Mikhail, but they don't swim.
I do laugh.
They don't. It's like, okay, you pick a race and you put it out there in the calendar, and on a few weeks before, it's like, oh, there's that swim part of it. Let me take a swim lesson or call up whoever my local program might be and see if I could get 2 or 3 weeks of swimming in. That is probably the biggest mistake that I see out there. It's because the swim is only 10% or so of a half Ironman or Ironman race, it's sort of put to the back burner. So obviously that's a big, big problem. Unfortunately, those are some of the folks that get into the most difficulty in races, thus being by being unprepared. I think another one that I see quite a bit is there is a thinking process by many athletes that technique is the sort of the holy grail. They get involved in the sport or they pick a race to do and think, I got to go take a swim lesson and get my technique fixed because I'm having difficulty or whatever the reasons may be. And I think there's sort of almost an oversubscription of this thing that technique's going to fix everything. So I think that's the second one. Not recognizing that technique is important, but for the most part, a lot of triathletes have pretty decent technique. They just don't realize that it's a delicate dance between the technical demands and the right training protocols. And most think that many think, I should say, that because you swim and get a little bit winded, that it's a technical problem. It's usually not. It's a specific muscular endurance issue. You might be super fit and running, but it doesn't mean you hop in the swimming pool and you're going to be able to swim a bunch of laps. So that's another one. And then for the folks that do train and put a fair amount of time into their into preparation. So here's your audience that's actually been a little bit more thoughtful and put planning into it and realize I do have to spend time swimming. Many swim at 1 gear effort, sort of a steady state, or they don't really vary outputs very much. Or they've decided or believe that they really just have sort of 2 gears, on and off, and it's sort of better to stay in the off gear because when they really try to go fast, their heart rate blows up too much. So let's swim at this other effort level that they're very comfortable at. So we see a lot of that. And then finally, I think for athletes that are willing to try new things or willing to listen to podcasts such as this or read and want to experiment and attempt changes, whether they're technical changes, whether they're workout prescriptive changes, whatever they might be, there's a little bit of impatience. Well, I did that a couple of times and it didn't work out. Well, that's right. You only did it a couple of times. It's going to take a fair number of trials over a certain period of time. So to me, those are sort of the 4 things. Impatience, not enough effort changes in workout. Most don't swim at all or very much. And then thinking technique is sort of the holy grail. Those are the 4 that I would rank the 4 important ones that I've observed over my, God knows, 35 years of doing this.
So a follow-up on the technique question: is there a threshold when you need to, if you're really really new and swim really slowly, when you just focus on technique, or is it always a mixture? And when do the balance swing in what sort of way? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
It's a great question. That's where the art of teaching comes in. And you can sit there all day long and teach the mechanics and the science of the sport, but this is the art where someone who has experience recognizes when it's time to turn off technique and turn on more training, so to speak. But generally, here's some sort of basic thresholds. Anyone that comes into the sport that's either relatively new to it or who is unfit in swimming, they've taken 6-7 months off, or the season is over, they haven't done any swimming for 2 or 3 months, and they come back in and think, I got to get a swim lesson. Wrong. You got to spend 3 weeks swimming 3 times a week. Excuse me. 10 sessions or so you can at least build back some specific muscular endurance, so you can then absorb any sort of technical tips or technical demands that were laid upon you. But trying to make technical changes while you don't have any specific muscular endurance fitness falls far short of being able to achieve what the athlete wants to achieve. So spend several weeks getting some form of fitness and then layer on the technical end. And then it's a delicate balance. Technique, training, training, technique. And they do go hand in hand. That's in a very narrow time frame. Expand it out to a year-long time frame or an entire season, then there needs to be some, in my opinion, some form of, using the trendy word today, periodization of this portion of the season we can do more technical work. This portion of the season we can do, whatever it is, a massive block of endurance training or foundational training. So I think longer horizon, you can allocate more time or more dedicated time to the technical aspect.
And one of the other things that you mentioned, the fact that they don't vary their outputs a lot, if at all, then that's something that's very specific to what sort of training they're doing. So is there anything else related to kind of the training specific side? Not because the other things were more general, I guess, the patient side and not doing fitness. Well, okay, that's related to program as well. But are there specific things, for example, too much or too little speed, endurance, threshold training, whatever, that you think that triathletes are getting wrong?
I don't know if they're getting it wrong. It hurts to push yourself, right? Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why we're talking about how a swim squad is so great, because you manage to push yourself a little more when you're in a swim squad.
Right. There's that guy or girl next to you, and they're half a body length ahead or a body length ahead, or whatever it may be. So you receive a little extra motivation to press yourself further. And when you're swimming alone, you don't have that opportunity, and so it hurts. You feel that pain, and it's easy to just go, you know what, I'm too much out of my comfort zone, and you sort of back down. So it seems like most athletes stay in this sort of pretty tight banner of output. And let's give a specific example. If you asked an athlete to descend their swimming times or ascend their output, okay, go a little faster in each repetition. Give them 4 100s. I'd like you to swim each 100 faster. Well, what typically happens, I've found, is that their times, the variance in times between their first 100, second, third, and fourth is fairly narrow. The delta is small. The times are tightly clustered, and many think, well, I put in all this extra effort to not go much faster. Well, a lot of times the problem lies in that the first one was too fast. So they really have to learn to back down in effort from their sort of steady state comfort zone, even go easier than that. Pretty much everybody can run a 12-minute mile, right?
I think so.
Most folks. Yeah. 12 or 13-minute mile. That's fairly easy. But if you ask somebody if we could agree that, well, let's make it really easy. Everybody could run a 15-minute mile, providing you're fully able-bodied and so on. So if you told them to run fast, do 4 1-mile repeats and run faster in each one, well, if you started at 8-minute mile pace and your best mile is 7:30, well, you mightn't be able to have much improved performance as you go through your 4 1-mile repeats. But if you started at a 15-mile pace, you'd be able to go a 15-mile pace, then a 12-mile pace, and then a 9-mile pace, and then you might end up and hit your fastest mile pace at 7 minutes by the end, as an example. The delta is really, really wide now. So I think they have to learn to swim easier to start with, go to another effort that's moderate effort, go to a very strong aerobic effort, and go really out of their comfort zone, completely out of it on the fourth effort. And the extra output for number 4 in this example doesn't really give a huge benefit in performance at that moment. But that's why we have training and repetition, and we do this over and over and over. We come back to that impatient thing. Well, I didn't really go that much faster. Well, we've just done this one time. We got to build this into, look at this over a 3-week period and then repeat it again over another 3-week cycle and so on. So there are a couple of basic examples.
Do you think that it's difficult for many athletes to really push themselves to the pain cave in swimming the same way that they can do in running or cycling for whatever reason? And if so, why?
I don't know if, I think some of that may be personality driven. I'm not sure exactly. Some of it's just if someone didn't have an athletic background prior to getting to the sport of triathlon, they're not really used to pushing their bodies to those limits of absolute pain. So you have to be sort of coaxed along a bit. And you have to be encouraged, and folks have to know that, well, if you really want great performance, and not to the exclusion of career and family and so on, but if you want to be the best that you can be, well, these are some of the things you have to do. This is why having a coach is helpful, because this is not their bailiwick. It's not what they do for a profession, right? So they need some guidance.
So that's a great segue into talking about the right training prescription then. And as you said, what was it, 35 years in coaching, and you started with triathletes right away and coaching them to swim, if I'm not mistaken. So what's your take, if you give us a broad overview of the right training prescription for swimming?
Well, I don't know if there's a right training prescription. There's what I've sort of become more aligned to over the last decade or so, after trying many different things and coming from a swimming background, although I started coaching triathletes first in 1983. I think there's some misinformation in the sport of triathlon from the swimming perspective, at least, that is being managed as time goes on, because the sport is relatively new compared to many other sports, right? So it's getting better and better. If we look at the 90s, I'll give a little historical perspective. In the 80s, there were no coaches, none to my knowledge. And by the time the 90s came around, there were a few more coaches. And then into the 2000s, you started getting a lot of coaches, because the sport then became an Olympic sport. So there's been a progression of coaches, of the quantity of coaches, I should say, over the decades. In the 90s, there was a particular way of even, because very few people were doing it, teaching, here's what should be done on the swim. And some of it was very traditional, and some of it came from coaches that were swim coaches. Well, that's fine. Some of it does apply, and it's very important, but not all of it applies. And I've used this example, and I can't recall if we did it in our last podcast when you interviewed me, but
it's more than 100 episodes ago, so let's just take it again if that's the case.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry about that. If I've used the example of Usain Bolt, a terrific runner, but not because he's a terrific runner, we would hire Usain Bolt's coach to coach us in a half marathon run in a triathlon. The guy coaches an athlete that runs a 10-second race, 19 seconds if he decides to double the distance and go at 200, and that's it. So the training prescription, the technical prescription, everything would be completely different for somebody who's running a half marathon in a triathlon, or even a 10K in an Olympic distance, needless to say, a marathon in an Ironman. So what we've had is a number of coaches who've come in with various technical thoughts from the swimming background and training prescription thoughts from swimming, and they brought it into the triathlon, and it has sent somewhat of a confusing message. And we still have it. We certainly, in North America, it's here quite a bit. So I think we need to really look at the demands of this sport. What are those? And then extract from swimming, what does competitive swimming, what are the things that were done in competitive swimming that can add value, and then take away the things that don't have an application to it. Here's one that doesn't have an application: flip turns. It doesn't matter if you can do a flip turn or not. It adds no value, zero, to swimming a half Ironman or an Ironman race, although some coaches would debate and say it does. But in a time-budgeted triathlete schedule of swimming 2 hours a week, like most do, and in fact, for many, that's their maximum time budget, spending time doing flip turns or learning to do them is a very low priority of where their time budget should be spent. So from this coach's perspective, other coaches would disagree. Therefore, I think we have to spend the time looking at sensible solutions for training and technique for the triathlete. So it's somewhat of a long-winded answer.
So can we talk a bit about some other things that we may see in magazines or on the internet that you would say come from a swimming point of view, but aren't necessarily a good time investment for triathletes, so that listeners can learn to recognize them? Kicking's a perfect one. We don't need to kick for propulsion in triathlon. We need to learn to kick well enough so our kick doesn't create damage or take away from propulsion. But trying to become a better kicker from a propulsive perspective is a complete waste of time, unless you're an ITU athlete at the elite level. That's a different audience. But for your general fat part of the bell curve, kicking is of low value for the purpose of propulsion. We do need to learn to have reasonably good kicking mechanics so it doesn't have a negative impact on performance. But trying to allow it to have a positive impact on performance, I don't happen to think that's the best time spent. We can more readily teach somebody to pull a lot better and become a much faster swimmer through pulling a lot rather than kicking. Plus, boy, those triathletes love to wear the pull buoys, don't they? Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So there's music to their ears there.
Is there anything else and any other things that come to mind?
How about early vertical forearm? Kind of the sexy buzz thing of triathlon in the last couple of years. Does that have value to the triathlete? Well, if we just took early vertical forearm on its own and have a discussion on it, and we go back and look at swimming in the 1970s, 40 years ago, they didn't have an early vertical forearm in swimming then. Now it's what they teach to some extent in modern day swimming. And athletes are not that much faster. They're a little bit faster, but they're not that much faster. And in fact, we could argue that the reason that they're faster is because they have better dives, much better push-offs on the walls with all the butterfly kicking where they're allowed to go 15 meters on the water. So if we took all of that out, one could argue that they're no faster than they were 40 years ago in freestyle. So now, enter early vertical forearm, just in the swimming arena. Is that really important? Now let's take it and put it into the triathlon arena, where being able to have an early vertical forearm, and all that simply means is once the hand enters the water, the first thing you try to do is pop the elbow up and keep it super high, close to the surface, while the hand itself goes deeper down so you can grab onto the water, but that elbow stays really high. So that particular demand or ask of the triathlete, it's very difficult for them to do because they don't have the mobility to do it relative to a swimmer. And especially if they come from a running background where their upper bodies tend to be much stiffer or nowhere near as limber as a swimmer, we're asking them to do something that's near to, if not impossible to do. Why are we doing this? but it became the sexy thing for triathlon coaches or coaches to bring into the sport of triathlon. I don't think it has much value here. No.
So let's move on to then what are the elements that we need to include in our swim training that are specific and valuable for triathlon swimming?
Well, I happen to think, I'm an old guy, right? So I'm not as, I'm not like young folks who or much of certainly society at times, it tends to look for quick success. For a while I used to use the term we're in this sort of societal phase of instant success. And as a former magazine owner and publisher, that's what you're taught to write, how you're taught to have headlines, 5 tips to do this, become, buy real estate in 30 days, 3 tips to achieve success overnight, become a millionaire in 6 months. I mean, everything was just time crunched. The grabbing headlines to get somebody into the story. Well, there's sort of that in triathlon too. Buy my 12-week plan for success. Well, I tend to look at things over a much longer horizon, 1 to 2 years. And when we write our plans, they're planned for at a minimum of a year at a time. We break it into 5 phases within that year. So when someone comes into our program or even on our subscription plan that we have, and they ask at times, I'm doing a race in 90 days or 120 days. Could you write me a plan for it? I can't. It's not what we offer. It's not my offering. It's to me, that's a short-term bite. So to answer your question, I think we need to have a much longer lens if you truly want to use triathlon as a lifestyle and be able to do it for multiple years rather than be a one-hit wonder or just in there for a bucket list doing a triathlon race. That's just not my customer to start with. I prefer to have this as a lifestyle and teach people to look at things from a longer-term perspective. So longer lens, number one. At a minimum, look at this at a year, break it into some phases, and then, lay out your plan and work your plan.
Yeah, it takes a long time to become an overnight success, as they say. I was just having an interview. I don't know if it will be released before or after yours, but with a teammate of mine that she won her age group 3 times in the European Championships for the Olympic and sprint distances. And she started as an adult and completely new to swimming and everything, but worked consistently for 10 years, and then she got her wins, and that's kind of it was very motivational, and I think that will be very, very educational as well to realize that long-term lens is really what it takes if you want to become really good at something. It's like with the 10,000 hour rule, whether you believe that that's a fact or not, but there's definitely value in the in the actual concept.
You mentioned it just a minute ago. You used a wonderful phrase, becoming an overnight success. I used this example in a talk that I gave about Gordon Ramsay, who many folks may know, especially Europeans, the chef. And Gordon has a coach in his homeland, but when he's in the United States, he swims in our program. And I use Gordon as an example. Many folks know the name, and you've seen him on TV as a celebrity chef and so on. But if you know Gordon's story, it took him 17 years to become an overnight success. No one saw the 17 years when he was working in the kitchen, sweeping the floor to start off. And then you climb your way up to become this Gordon Ramsay, quotations, overnight success. But it was
absolutely.
It was a lead up.
Yeah. So how do you structure your workouts? I know that we can kind of weave in your subscription program and how that works as well. Many listeners probably listen already to your podcast, the Tower 26 Be Race Ready podcast, which I highly recommend that you do if you don't already. So you have usually 2 key sessions every week that are kind of the must-do sessions. And can you expand upon what goes into them? And you can pick really any time of the year, like what are you doing now, for example, and then if you can highlight why that's important for triathletes to do what you're doing and why you're doing it.
So I think, Mikhail, we have to look at this through the from a very macro perspective, and how does triathlon fit into, let's remove a pro athlete for a moment and just look at the amateur. How does triathlon fit into your lifestyle, into your career, into your other sports or hobbies, and into your family? And you start with a budget, a time budget that you're able to allocate to training. And training meaning swim, bike, run. And any other pieces of training you would adding, strength training, whatever it might be. What is your time budget, your total allocated number of hours you can spend a week? And then with the assistance of some sort of professional, I would encourage athletes to use a coach to help them then break out what portions would be segmented for each sport. This many hours for swim, this much for bike, this much for run. And by the way, that prescriptive amount would vary depending on an athlete's strength or weakness. Somebody who's a terrific swimmer would not need to have the same ratio of somebody who has no swim background, as an example. So once you have that allocated out, and now you get down to your specific question as to the swim, most athletes are going to have, or many, I should say, would have maybe swim 2 to 3 times a week. Well, if you're going to swim just 2 times a week and that's it, they both have to be key sessions. Each session has to hit many of the highlights of what needs to help them along in progression. If they have 3 times a week, then at a minimum 2 need to hit those highlights. If you have 4 times a week to swim, again, at least 2 have to hit the highlights, and then 3 and 4 could have different variations of supporting elements. But I happen to think you need a couple times a week of those injections and this would apply for all 3 sports, not just swimming. You need to have 2 foundational sessions each week. And I just don't mean that from a training perspective. That's also from a full presence perspective, where you are completely engaged. The world is shut out. You're not thinking about what's going on at your job or your family at that moment. You are 100% dedicated emotionally and physically to the activity for those 2 times. So all of our sessions, as it relates to whether it's our subscription plan or our location-based program, there are 2 key sessions, and then there are supporting sessions after that. And there's some simplistic reasons for that. Folks have family commitments. They have travel related to their jobs and so on. So if you had a plan that had 3 or 4 workouts of swimming in this case, since that's what we're talking about, and they had to miss 1 or 2 of their sessions during the week, don't miss the key sessions. You know what the bullseye sessions are. So drop the others. You got to nail these 2 down. So there's that specific portion as to why. And
as for the key sessions, is there recommendations for how long they need to be?
Again, that would be determined by the where the athlete is in their progression. Do they have a background in swimming or not? What they're trying to achieve and so on. But in the perfect world, if you have 75 minutes available to you, I think you can get a lot of good work done in 75 minutes. If you have 90 minutes, that's even better, obviously, especially if you're training for an Ironman. But these 45-minute sessions that I see that are written out that many athletes do, and they're doing it just once or twice a week, that's not going to have a great return on investment if they want good performance and they don't have any sort of swim background or not really a good knowledge base on the swim segment.
Yeah, you see a lot of stagnation in swimming with people that are posting on Facebook groups and things like that about why can't I improve, and then people ask about their training, and it turns out that they're swimming those 2 times 45 minutes per week. It tends to be what I've seen is the default, at least in those athletes that aren't progressing in their swim. So yeah, I would definitely agree that there is a case for making those sessions longer. That's what people do on the bike. They don't follow the coach's order. They do the bikes way longer than the coach says oftentimes. But on the swim, it's not so much.
look at what many folks do. They got to get that swim session done in maybe the middle of their workday, get to their local pool. They got 45 minutes, or right after work, the pool is going to close, so let me get there. So there's sort of a little bit of cramming to start with. And then, and we talked about this earlier in the episode, what are they doing in those 45 minutes? Sometimes 45 minutes can work, but it's what are you doing? And the ones who are stuck, and we get many of those, especially in our subscription program, I'd say that's the majority of our folks in our subscription plan. I've been stuck, coach, for 2, 3, 4. The longest is 7 years. I haven't made any improvements. And when you review what they've done, well, yeah, you're not going to make any improvements doing that. That's why it stayed the same every year. At least you haven't slid backwards, but you stayed stationary. So let's break you out of that stagnant pattern. We've got to stimulate different training protocols.
So let's talk a bit more about the subscription program, and maybe we can highlight one of those examples that you mentioned. Somebody who has plateaued, since there are so many that seem to be stuck in one speed at one level in their swim, and how using the program has helped them. First, if you give us an overview of what the program really is, how it works for those listeners that don't know about it, but then if you can get into some case study like that.
So the plan is mainly for those in the Northern Hemisphere, so it would fall into your audience, because we follow the Northern Hemisphere's race schedule. A little bit different, obviously, for Australia and New Zealand.
This is a global podcast. We have listeners in all over the world, so yes. But I get you.
But okay, sure. So we follow the Northern Hemisphere's training racing calendar, which generally would mean the bulk of races are between April and October, and then in those winter months, less races or almost no racing and lesser training. So we set up a plan, our yearly plan around that, and carry the athletes through 5 different phases within the year. And we talked about one of them earlier. We do have a phase that's mainly technical, and that's during the off season, so to speak. And then we have a foundation phase, which we're in right now. And then we have some skill building for open water, and then we're in our race phase. So there are a number of different phases, but the key thing, some of these athletes, I would say almost all of these athletes that come into our plan have, many are self-coached, and some have tried different plans or have taken workouts from elsewhere, but there's been no sort of macro plan as to why the workout, what's the value of the workout that they're doing. It's one workout in a 12-week plan, or it's a workout that, here's what my friend's doing that he or she told me that worked for them really well. Well, not because it worked for them means it's going to work for you. So this is much more methodically and carefully laid out. And in fact, if you went, or your audience went and listened to our most recent episode, which I think is number 46, or you can just go to tower26.com and click on podcast, and the most recent episode as of today's date, which we're talking on the 13th of February. So the episode that's prior to this date, that episode, we interview Jamie, who was one of our podcast listeners, who had been stuck for a few years. And she sent in a question. I answered the question on air. And based on her question alone, I felt, oh my gosh, this poor lady has been working hard for 2 or 3 years. And just the mere fact of the question that she asked, which was, by the way, if I started doing flip turns and workout, will that help? Just that question alone told me everything I needed to know about why this lady has not improved in her swimming. And I made her an offer. Join our plan. If you don't improve, I'll give you all your money back. Here she'd been stuck for 3 years. Within 1 month, she was already 5 seconds faster in her 100 freestyle, and 1 minute, and I forget the exact amount, 1 minute and 20 something or 30 seconds faster in her 1K time trial in 1 month.
That's amazing improvement.
But she had been stuck in how she was doing things and expected a different result. Only because sweet, very sophisticated, well-educated, terrific athlete, but just didn't know what to do in this particular arena. and therefore stuck to the same pattern.
What?
Now she's broken out and doing obviously quite well and very happy. Unfortunately for her, she didn't get her money back.
Yeah, I think she'll probably take the improvements. I know that I would take the improvements.
Yes, I mean, it's been obvious. That request is, or that is available out there for anybody who doesn't get any better, but we haven't had a request yet for money back because it doesn't happen. It's people are the ones who are on our plan are the ones who've been stuck.
So what changed for her in her training? Do you remember how she trained specifically, and in what period of your plan did she join? So what kind of training were you doing?
Interestingly, she joined in our technical phase, and so obviously received benefits from the technical phase. But mainly, Jamie was similar to many others, trained at one gear, one effort. So if you train at 75%, and let's say that 75% effort is a 130 per 100 pacing. And let's make it 140 per 100 for meters. And you're 140 per 100 pacing in meters in your workouts consistently. What do you think happens on race day? You're going to race 140 per 100, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to race any faster, but somehow many think they're going to be faster on race day. No, you're going to swim 140. So you have to get them to start swimming 135s in workout and 130s and even 110s. Oh, what do you mean? I can't do that. Yes, you can. For a very short time. In fact, Mikhail, I bet you can run a 4-minute mile for 20 meters, right? If you told somebody you can run a 4-minute mile, no, that's not possible. I'm sure you can for 10 meters only. Well, we can in swimming. You can swim a 110 for a 100 if we only swam 20 meters. So now we're starting to stimulate something that hasn't been stimulated before. So none of this is rocket science, but you get stuck at that 140 pace and you race at 140 and then you stay there for 2 or 3 years and nothing ever changes.
Yeah, and I'm sure that that's something that even in your technical phase, you have those small sprinkles of speed blended in the program. And so it's, definitely makes sense. And absolutely, you're right. When you go to the pool and see triathletes around you, but they're pretty easy to recognize. At least in Helsinki, where I used to swim, they always had their own lanes, the triathletes, and the swimmers were at the other side of the pool. It was a pretty big pool. But you see that one gear phenomenon time and time again. So
yeah, and also it's important for athletes to recognize that give the change that you are introducing several weeks to take hold. Several meaning at least 3 to take hold, providing you're swimming 3 times a week. You want to have about 10 sessions where whatever you've introduced, that you've done it 10 times. And 10 times doesn't mean 10 arm strokes. It means whatever it is that you've introduced, you've done it for a certain number of minutes in a session, multiplied by 10 sessions over hopefully 3 weeks or so. No more than 4 weeks, but definitely 3 weeks would be ideal. And 10 opportunities to see some sort of change. Need to stimulate, re-stimulate, keep doing it. Doesn't happen in just 1 or 2 times, especially if one has never been an athlete. It has to be stimulated out. If one was an athlete, it now has to be it'll resurface, but it's still going to take some time. It's in there, it needs to come out. But those who haven't had any sort of athletic background, well, we have to train it. And it'll happen. It does happen. Happens to everybody. They get better.
I started thinking there when you said 3 times per week. Do you have any suggestive thoughts on what happens if you increase your swimming from that normal 2 times per week to 3 times per week? I know that's something that interests at least myself because of the athletes that I coach. So I coach 15 athletes, and I think that 11 or 12 of them probably swim 2 times per week. That's basically what they have time for allocated. But can you see really significant benefits by bumping it up to 3, or what's your take on that?
Absolutely. Let's do this in math. You sound like a very scientific guy to me. If you did something twice a week and then you went to 3 times a week, what's the percentage increase?
Oh, you make me calculate 50.
50%. Most people would think a third, but it's a 50% increase. You've therefore increased what you've been doing by 50%. And if you had no background in that activity before, boy, you better believe that's going to be a huge benefit if you have the time budget for it. So yes, going from 2 or 3 times to 3 times a week, massive benefits.
Yeah, and that's obviously we assume here that you're doing the right thing in the pool or something along the right directions. So final thing, we have had the rapid fire questions with you, so I'm not going to make you do them again, but instead
those are always fun though. I like those.
Yeah, but I don't, well, yeah, let's skip them because I haven't really prepared. But yeah, I can ask you one more question that I started to introduce more recently that you haven't answered. But before that, final words about the subscription programs. Where can people find out more about that and how to join and that sort of thing?
Oh, thanks for bringing that up. They can go to coaching.tower26.com. Coaching.tower, and that's TOWER26.com. And all the info is right there.
Perfect. And then the one rapid fire question that I'm pretty sure that you didn't answer when you last were on is, who's somebody in triathlon, swimming, or endurance sports that you admire and look up to?
You know, I'm such a nerd sometimes, Mikhail. I really, you know, all of these athletes that are certainly at the elite end and on the swimming end that have raced so well, and then the ones that have just made tremendous improvements. But it's similar to the Gordon Ramsay story. Like, let's take Richard Murray from South Africa. Here's a guy who just wasn't a very good swimmer, and now over the last several years, he's just progressed a little bit each year, and now he's, you know, close to being at the front pack. So I'm in awe of all of them. I mean, I don't have favorites per se. If any one of them give me 5 minutes to talk to them, I'd be delighted.
Perfect. And yeah, that's about it for this interview. And let's maybe wait a little less than 100 episodes before we have you on again, because I really, really enjoyed this and found it really valuable and educational for me. So I hope that the listeners will find it the same. Thank you so much, Gerry.
I'm waiting. Thank you, but I'm waiting for you to come visit us in Los Angeles when.
Yeah, we talked about that, and it's still definitely very much going to happen. I'm pretty sure.
Well, all right. I'll hold you to it.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Thank you, Gerry.
Thank you very much.
Really hope that you enjoyed that interview as much as I enjoyed talking to Gerry. My key takeaways from this interview, there are quite a few, but I tried to distill it down, as Gerry usually does so brilliantly himself, to 3 main points. And the first one is, we've talked about this many times before on this podcast, but don't think you can just work on technique and become faster. You need to work on fitness. That's just, there's no getting around it. And Gerry was pretty upfront with the fact that, yeah, it can hurt. It can be very painful to be swimming, but you need to do that just like you do biking and running. The second would be to vary your paces. And funnily enough, today that I record this outro, the day after talking to Gerry, one part of our swimming set was an 8 times 200, and we would descend. So each 200 needed to be faster than the first one. So that's 8 times that you need to be faster. So you need to start really slow to manage that. So for example, for me, that meant going from, I actually did the first one a bit too fast. I should have done it maybe 10 seconds slower or so. But from 3 minutes 35 seconds down to 2:46, so 2 minutes 46 seconds. The idea was to have as much as a minute from the slowest 200 to the fastest. So that would be like a 30 second per 100 differential. And that's just one example. There are many ways that you can vary your paces, but learn how to vary your paces, feel different outputs and how they correlate with actual paces. And the third takeaway that I would like to highlight in this episode is that it takes time, consistency, patience, and training with great purpose. And so that's just a general piece of advice that it should be pretty self-explanatory. But I think that sometimes, even though we intuitively know it, we don't actually practice it as well as we should do, and we become impatient, we become inconsistent, and we train without a purpose. especially when it comes to swimming. This is a story that I might tell another time about how I got in a very hotly debated Facebook thread. Got sucked into that one time when somebody was asking for recommendations for headphones or music players for swimming, and I got a bit carried away with talking about training with purpose and why those kinds of devices should not be allowed on a triathlete in a swimming pool. But let's not talk anymore about that, but just make sure that when you train, whether it's swimming or something else, train with a purpose. And again, you can listen to Gerry's previous interview on the show in episode 3. That was on the foundational elements of triathlon swimming technique, tautness, alignment, and propulsion. And I want to give a strong call to action today. If you feel that you're stuck in your swimming, like we talked about in the interview, if you are in the large majority of triathletes, or you are like them, you already spend a heck of a lot of money on triathlon, including gear, races, travels, and gizmos and gadgets. And so I would like you to really, really think long and hard about if you are spending that money in the most high leverage places. And the fact is, if you're stuck in your swimming, you're probably not, because you shouldn't be stuck. And if that's you, if that resonates with you, go and sign up for Gerry's subscription program on coaching.tower26.com. I'll link to that in the episode description and the show notes. And you heard him. It's a completely risk-free investment. You get your money back if you don't improve. Which means that you likely won't get your money back, but hey, you'll improve. So, and I have no affiliation with the program, don't get any sort of kickbacks for saying this. I just say it as a fellow coach who really admire the work that Gerry does and knowing the power of investing in good coaching. So I would say that if you're stuck, then your first order priority should be to get out of that rut, and I think that probably this is one of the best investments that you can make in triathlon, to sign up for Gerry's program. If nothing else, if you don't already, make sure that you at least start listening to the Be Race Ready podcast. All right, so the next episode on That Triathlon Show is an interview with Joanne Dolcutter. She's an amazing sports psychologist and a former elite athlete herself. She has finished second in the Hawaii Ironman, and she's coached on in the sports psychology realm no less than 5 Olympic medalists in their mental preparation. So you can't really find a much more credible sports psychologist than that. I was really so lucky that I managed to get her on the show, and I'm super excited to share that interview with you in a few days' time. But in the meantime, thank you to Triathlon Corner for supporting the show and keeping it running. Everything you need when it comes to gear, clothing, and gadgets you can find on triathlon-corner.store. And remember that right now you can get 10% off your next purchase by using the discount code ThatTriathlonShow on triathlon-corner.store. And thank you as well to Precision Hydration for sponsoring the episode. And remember that to get the best electrolyte products for you, you can take the free online sweat test that you find on precisionhydration.com. And that will give you the how and why you should fuel with certain electrolyte strengths. You will get a highly specific plan for what to do before races in the preload phase, what to do during races, and even a bit about what to do after races, although the before and the during are definitely the most important parts when it comes to hydration and electrolyte balance. Again, use the discount code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, to get your first box for free. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.